Dr. Vinod Kumar Jha is the head of English department at SMK University, Dumka, Jharkhand. He specializes in linguistics and teaching of English as a second language. He worked as a resource person at Academic Staff College, Ranchi. He has translated a book of Hindi short stories into English titled The Speechless and Other Stories. Also, Let's Kill Gandhi, etc. Professor Vinod, being in his service for over 38 years in teaching, contributed a lot to the nation by publishing good numbers of books, chapters, and research articles. He delivered academic lectures and taught courses in many universities and institutes in India and abroad. His associations with MTF continues from the previous training batches. With this brief introduction, may I invite Professor Vinod Kumar Jha to deliver the lecture.
Hello and good morning to all of you. My greetings to all of you. My lecture will be in two parts. In the first part, I'll be introducing the fundamentals of translation and literary translation. And in the second part, I'll be talking about my own experiences as a literary translator. I have translated 3 books, one from Hindi into English and 2 from English into Hindi. The topic that I have been given is the problems of literary translation. I have been all my life a classroom teacher. Maybe I have I have also done some research work in teaching of English as a second language, but in literary translation, I stumbled into just by chance. There was a writer here, an IS officer, working in our area, and he knew me somehow, and he was a good story writer, and he just asked me to write or translate his stories, and then those stories were published, and then I was asked by the publisher of that group to translate other books. I will be talking about the problems of literary translation. Problems of literary translation. With the kind permission of the organizers, I would like to rephrase this topic by adding a word: the problems and challenges of literary translation. Because literary translation is a profession which requires 2 things: an absolute love of literature and an absolute love of the 2 languages, one from which you are translating and the other into which you are translating. Without this love, without this passion for language and literature, literary translation is not possible, if not impossible. It is not feasible in normal circumstances. So, if you love your job, if you are translating literary texts with love and passion, those problems will become challenges. And I would take some liberty of adding one more word to this topic: the problems and challenges and joy of literary translation. When when you are translating texts from one language into another, I have a very limited experience. I have translated only from and into Hindi and English. I do not speak or know other languages apart from certain dialects of Hindi or language Maithili or like that. So, but I know that joy. As a translator, you are cobbling words together to transfer the message from the source language to the target language, and then you're struggling with words, and suddenly, like some kind of unseen circuitry, you find a word or a phrase that fits into the whole design, and the heavens light up. And you have a joy of having accomplished something really remarkable. And when you find someone reading your translated book and telling you that he doesn't find it being a translated book, but as he's reading it as something original, the joy. So the topic I changed to the problems, the challenges, and the joy of literary translation. Literary translation. Without literary translation, our world would not have been what it is today. All the cultural and intellectual progress that we have made through the centuries, through millennium, has been possible also because of literary translation. Because of the translation, the movements like the Renaissance and Reformation occurred. Closer home, our own Indian Renaissance and the West's perception of India changed, transformed because of translation. But literary translators have been a neglected group among the academics. How many of us know the names of translators who translated War and Peace by Tolstoy, or Turgenev's writings, The Virgin Land, or Fathers and Sons? How many of you know the translator of The Crime and Punishment? But still, we have read those books. We have nurtured our imagination. We have nurtured our intellectual hunger on those books we have read. We have been transformed by those books. Literary translation has been there, but the recognition of literary translation as something great, as something remarkable, began in the 1970s, when maybe because of the rise of literary theory and the emphasis and the very close reading of language, and then also because of one great writer, Gregory Rabassa. I would mention his name at the beginning of my lecture. Gregory Rabassa, all of you know his name, who translated that Garcia Marquez's book 100 Years of Solitude into English, and then famously Marquez said that the translated book was better than his original one, and the effect, the influence on many writers, contemporary writers, or like Salman Rushdie and maybe Toni Morrison, some of the greatest writers of our times, novel writers of our times, they were influenced not by the original book of Garcia Marquez, 100 novels, but they were influenced rather by the translation of that book, and then literary translation, and because of many other factors where they're working for establishing this profession of literary translation on its. But first, I'll be talking about the problems of literary translation. I'll be talking about the problems of literary translation in different genres, poetry, a novel, a drama. But first, I would take the participants who have joined this National Translation Mission, and maybe many of them are first-timers, to introduce them to the concept of a translation itself. I'm afraid it is a very preliminary kind of concept, but I have prepared it for those who are joining a translation profession for the first time. So I'll be using some slides for some time of my lecture, and this is what, so this is the title of my lecture. But the slides are concerned with the basic concept of translation. Translation occurs when a message or text produced in one language, the source language, is converted into a message in another language. that is the receptor or target language. When used in contrast to interpretation, the conversion of a spoken text, translation denotes the conversion of the written text, and interpretation, the spoken text. Translation studies is a long-established tradition that examines both theory and practice. Concerns of concerns of translation. There are three main concerns of translation. One is prescriptive. In prescriptive concern, it is to give practical advice to translators. The tradition has existed for millennia and dates back to Cicero in ancient Rome. In recent times, it expresses itself in the search for reliable means of assessing translation quality and in an academic ways in translator training issues. The second one is philosophical. Scholars and philosophers from the medieval Jewish Kabbalists to Jacques Derrida in modern France have explored how translation as communication that transcends a single language might shed light on key issues on human communication. For example, whether there might have been a single ancestor of all the world's languages, whether meaning is tied to language or independent of it, or whether one person's words mean the same when spoken by other. And then the third concern of a translation is applied linguistics. Nowadays, however, translation studies is usually seen as a discipline that explores the nature of cross-linguist communication. It draws on and contributes to a wide range of fields such as semantics, pragmatics, and discourse analysis, psycholinguistics, communication science, and culture and gender studies. Equivalence. Equivalence is a key concept in translation studies. It is implying the degree of similarity between the source text and the target text. The degree of similarity can be assessed in two ways: size terms and quality terms. In size terms, the target may be roughly as long as the source. It may summarize the source text, or it may be an exegetic explanation, as in the case of translating Holy Scriptures. In quality terms, the target may parallel the source's exact words and syntax and interlinear translation, often in order to explain or gloss the source. It is not in the slide. Reproduce the source's semantic content, a literal translation, or convey the source's communicative effect, a communicative or dynamic equivalent translation. Establishing correct equivalence becomes especially problematic when source and target languages are very different in terms of culture, time, linguistic explicitness. A culture, there are certain words and expressions in languages and culture which cannot be understood in other cultures. Time, when a translator has to decide the time or age in which a language, the language of that age to which he has to translate into, and linguistic explicitness, third one. For instance, classical Chinese poetry's lack of pronouns causes problems for the translator into modern English. These are some of the problems that become evident when you are trying to establish equivalence between the source text and the target text. Recent models of translation see texts within the framework of a wider communication act in which a translator and source text receiver and target text producer is a key factor. And here is a model that conveys, implies, conveys the act of translation. Original writer, speaker, writes, speaks in the source text. It is heard, read, and heard by the translator. And then the translator writes or speaks into the target text, and that target text is read and heard by the target reader and listener. An expert translator has reading and writing or listening and speaking expertise in one or more specialist genres. Moreover, one source text may have several different equivalents, none of which is necessarily the best. Hence, the translator is now seen as less of a reproducer and more of a creator or recreator, making active choices on the basis of genre knowledge, intuitive feel, and personal preference. At the whole text level, the translators may have to choose between two models. One is source-oriented translation, that is, staying faithful to original writers or speakers' wording and intentions. This may involve foreignizing. It is deliberately retaining source language or source culture features. Idiosyncratic translation, reproducing the original's individualities, or both. Second is target-oriented translation, domesticating, keeping the target text's purpose, new purpose, and readership uppermost in mind. This is target-oriented translation. This involves domesticating, adapting the text to target culture norms, smoothing, removing the source's stylistic individualities, or both. In recent years, translation process studies have examined how translators translate. The translator may also have to make ideological decisions, choosing whom to translate and not to translate in a reason of conflicting identities inevitably means taking sides. Translating into a world language such as English, especially if domesticating techniques are used, may risk contributing to neo-imperialist world culture, although it may equally be a way for minor cultures to make themselves heard on their own terms. There is a feminist translation theory also. It raises ideological issues that extend beyond gender. These are some of the basic, thank you for now, just, these are some of the basic concepts that I have been able to prepare for the beginners, for the first timers, and then maybe there would be, sure there would be experts who would be teaching you more advanced theories of translation. And now I'm turning to the problems of literary translation. Traditionally, a translation has been of two kinds, literary and non-literary. Although recently there have been many theories of translation. But traditionally, translation has been of two kinds, literary and non-literary. Literary translation is concerned with the genres. Literary translation is the translation of literary texts in the genres of poetry, drama, novels, short stories, essays. When literary translation takes place, there are problems which the translator of a technical text may not face. Because the language in which literature is written is different from a technical language. the three genres: drama, poetry, and novel, short stories. These are the three genres in which there are different ways, there are different problems that a literary translator faces. For example, and you know, translation problems are not like maths problems, or that have only one or at most a strictly limited number of right answers. As a subject of literature, and literature is indisputably an art rather than science, and translation. So translation is subjective in essence. If literature is subjective, literary translation is also subjective. Reasonable people may well disagree about which of the several proposed alternatives to a particular literary translation problem best addresses it. Nevertheless, there are guidelines that can help us work us through the problems that a literary translator faces. When talking of the literary translation of drama, a drama translation is different from the translation of poetry and novel, because drama differs fundamentally from poetry and novel. Poetry and novel may originally be written for private reading, but drama is not originally written for private reading. Drama is originally written for public viewing. And in that sense, the translation of drama needs a different kind of care. While drama translation for the page has much in common with translation in other literary genres, transferring a play from one language into another for performance on a stage presents translator with problems of a different order. Unlike the reader of a play, a theater audience is not in a position to consult footnotes or encyclopedias containing information about unfamiliar cultural concepts and social situations. With the exception of explanatory comments provided in performance programs, audiences are left to fend for themselves when confronted with unknown, often bewildering information in a drama, in a source text. Also of importance is the notion of performability, the ease with which directors and actors can make a play come to life. It is an outcome crucially dependent on the use of spoken rather than written language. Often an indication of class, education, and geographical origin, the language of the different characters in a play is uniquely defined by their idiolect, sociolect, and dialect. In addition to other linguistic features, there is also the potential problem of the kind of a genre of the play to be translated, because a drama has also many subgenres. For example, a play originally conceived as expressionist or symbolist does not normally benefit from a naturalist approach to dialogue in translation. While talking of novel, when translating a novel has its own problems and challenges, the translator has to be looking for tone, diction, hidden meanings, basic mythoi, and so on. About this, I'll be talking about in my when I talk about my own experiences as a literary translator later. When we are talking of poetry, we look for the symbolism, the use of sound, a metaphor, and many other features that poets use to create a poetic effect. Poetry is a very different kind of genre, very different. Poetry is akin to music, and rhythm is one essential part of poetry. In translating poetry, it is a very, very crucial to keep a balance between the rhythm of the source text and to decide whether the rhythm has to be retained in the target text or not. Retaining the rhythm may result in kind of padding or skewed kind of translation. And if you do not retain rhythm, it may result in losing certain essential qualities of the poem, because a poet uses sounds to create meaning. If you remember poems by many poets, you know, they use sounds to create and support the meaning of their poems. I'll be talking about the problems that I have faced in translating the books that I translated. I have translated 3 books, as I told, as I spoke, in the beginning. I have translated 24 stories written by one Hindi writer, Subhash Sharma. He is a well-known writer. And 21 of those stories that I translated have been published in a book form, The Speechless and Other Stories. And I have translated a book by Tushar Gandhi. It is Let's Kill Gandhi. It is a well-known book. It is in 3 parts, and I have translated the first 2 parts of this book. In this process, I had to translate 2 poems also, the poems, well-known poems. And I'll be talking about the problems of literary translation more in a more detailed way when I'll be talking about these translations. In fact, while I was translating this, the first part of Let's Kill Gandhi, I had to translate a poem by Algernon Swinburne. It is an extract from Super Flumina Babylonis. And the second poem that I translated, it is at the beginning of the second part, that famous poem, Ekla Chalore by Rabindranath. That poem, Ekla Chalore, is here in this book in English translation. So I translated from the English version of Ekla Chalore from this book. So English in this case is the pivot language, the intermediary language. Originally it is written in Bengali, it is translated into English, and then I translated it into Hindi. Anyway, I'll be talking about it later. The first book that I translated of the short stories, The Speechless and Other Stories. It is a book of short stories, and it has 21 stories, and these stories bring the voice of the speechless, brings into the mainstream the voices of the speechless, the marginalized, those people who live in perpetual exposure to death. And one of the stories that I translated is the hunger. I'll be talking about these stories. First, I must tell you that while translating these stories, the first problem that I faced was the problem of translating the titles. Many titles which are the names of characters, you know, no problem. But there were certain titles which really posed great problems. One problem was Archer. There is a story, Archer. The title of the story, Archer, there is an English word, English phrase for it, the front of sari. And I found this translation in Hindi to English Dictionary, Oxford Hindi to English Dictionary, McGregor's a front of sari. But the word that is used as a title is not just a front of sari. It is something more than that. It is something very emotionally loaded. Achal is not just a front of sari. Achal is a protective shelter for a child who feels secure and blissful inside Achal. Mamta ka Achal, Ma ka Achal, Achal mein samet lena. I had to struggle. I had to decide what to do. And I decided, oh, let it be. I just let the same word in Hindi remain in my English translation, Achal, and I just added a subtitle to it, the front of sari. Then there was another story, Hari Katha Ananta. The title of that story is Hari Katha Ananta. Hari Katha Ananta is a well-known phrase from the religious, I think, text, Hari Katha Ananta. This is a story of a con man who is in the guise of a faith healer. And Hari Katha Ananta. This con man, in the guise of a faith healer, knows no bounds. And his guiles and his manipulative skills and his resourcefulness in gulling the people, preying upon the susceptibilities of the people, they have no limits. I struggled for the English. I found a phrase, an apt phrase for this title, Harikatha Ananda. I found the never-ending saga. But the never-ending saga did not capture that pungent taste that Harikatha Ananda has. Like if you remember that the modest proposal, this con man, is not just preying on the religious susceptibilities of the masses. He can even resort to criminalize a criminal act. And one of the characters in the story is a woman whose son has been kidnapped by this con man, by this Swamiji, who is called Swamiji in this story. Her son has been kidnapped. So this story is not just a satire, it is a blend of satire and tragedy. That woman wailing in front of Swamiji for her son, will rend your heart. And then I let it be, Harikatha Ananta, and I added that subtitle to it, the never-ending saga. There were many stories which had an English word for it: Bhook, Bejuban, Suryagrahan, Jameer, and then so those had their English words, and I translated them into English words. But these two titles, I had to retain the Hindi words. Now, when I was translating this book, these short stories, I decided to consult certain translation theories, and it was a long time back. Now, translation studies has come a long way from just those dichotomy between faithful and being faithful and beautiful. Translation theory has traveled a long way from those stages. But when I had started translating these stories, I was influenced by whether foreignizing or domesticating these two poles, between these two poles, I had to travel. I sometimes decided to create, to move away from the source text, the features of source text, and take up the features of the target text. I read a number of translation stories, but when it really came to the breast text, I know when it comes to the breast text, every translator has to decide his or her own way through the maze of theories, and he has to decide for his own. He has to decide his own, make his own choice. And one problem in translating the fiction, the short stories or the novel I haven't translated, is retaining the tone of the source text, the tone. When I was translating this story, Proof, Hunger. Hunger is the story of a family of Mahadalits in Bihar. That family fails to survive the messy transition of their village from a feudal society to becoming the beneficiary of the contemporary welfareism of a developmental state. The radical left groups that bring rhetorical equality to the deprived classes watch as a midwife while the frail patriarch of the family, his widowed daughter-in-law and her 3 children die, what is known in popular parlance as starvation deaths. The circumstances leading up to these deaths form the core of the story and expose all the agents who reduce these people to what Giorgio Agamben calls the bare life. Life perpetually exposed to death, which is closer as far as possible to animal existence. The family, one by one, losing every means of survival, selling the animals, the goats that they have, moving about in the village, getting no help from anyone, and then selling the last resource of their survival, the goats that they have kept for so long. And one by one, the members of the family dying of starvation. The tone of this novel, the atmosphere of this novel, the gloomy atmosphere of this novel. When I was translating, when I moved away from talking in terms, translation theory terms, foreignizing, to domestication, moving to the features of English language, I would feel that I'm losing that essence of the tone without which this story cannot be a story. And I felt that there might be some, I wondered if there were some biases built into a particular language, or maybe some bias built into English language, bias of positivity, or bias of gloom or negativity into English, built into English. I wondered this. At that time, I did not come across any research finding related to that. But later on, I came across a research finding, and that I would like some potential researchers, prospective researchers to go into this area. And I read a research article by Chris Danforth, an assistant professor of mathematics in Vermont University, and in that report he writes, fundamentally, he writes about his English language. Fundamentally, we have the happy bias built into our language. This is the line that I read. Overall English words, which he described as the atoms of language, he had his own mathematical strategy to do research on. on the biases in languages, and particularly English language. And he writes, tend to be more positive than negative, regardless of whether they are more common or rare. One reason that he puts forward is that English developed in a society that succeeded. I don't know what in what state that research is now, but I wonder what to say of the kind of society depicted in the present stories, unhappy, miserable, and frightening human situation, to say the least. Now, when you are translating stories from one language into another, particularly from Hindi into English, there are certain expressions which you cannot translate into a foreign language. For example, about this story, staying on with this story. This story presents a typical village in Bihar, caste, class conflicts, upper castes, landowning classes, lower classes, working classes, middle classes, a kind of cushion between the upper classes and the lower classes. The lower classes, their way of survival is the working on the farms of the upper castes. But now, with the new leftist movements, those working classes are now protesting, and they are feeling discontent, and they are in a mood to protest. They are in a mood to retort to the upper classes, to teach them a lesson. The planting season is arriving. The youth of the working classes of Mahadalit caste, they would not go to work in the fields. They are demanding higher wages. Demanding higher wages is just one reason for this refusal to work. They want the women of upper classes to work in the fields. You know, there is a line in this story. Ab ki bari bhado mein gori khalaiya kadam. They want the women of these lines, and I talked about the problems of translating a fiction. Hidden meaning is one of the problems. How much meaning is hidden in these lines? How much angst? How old? I think the angst as old as ages. That pent-up angst, about to burst out. This angst, how to translate this into English? That was a problem. I had to translate. There was no way. There would be a long explanation if I had to explain the hidden meaning of this in English. It would be a long explanation. But the story, it has to fit into the design and size of this story. No problem. I retained that expression. But these are the problems, typical problems of translating a fiction from one language into another. Now I'll talk about my experience of translating this book, Let's Kill Gandhi. I have translated the two parts. They are published, and the third part is in process. As I told you, the first part begins with a poem. This poem is by Algernon C. Swinburne. It is an extract, it is a long poem, and the extract is from this poem, Super Flumina Babylonis. The theme of the poem is the greatness of human personality, a timeless life that one achieves through sacrifice, through doing good to others. And this poem tries to capture the greatness of the personality of Gandhi. Let's kill Gandhi. Gandhi can die physically, but Gandhi will never die intellectually, ideologically, spiritually. Gandhi will live forever. And this poem tries to capture that enormity of the personality of Gandhi. I'll read out the poem to you, and then I'll read out the translation of the poem. Such a one never dies. He lives, he wakes. Its death is dead, not he. Death cannot kill him. Unto each man his handiwork, unto each his crown, the just fate gives. Whoso takes the world's life on him and his own lays down, he, dying so, lives. Whoso bears the whole heaviness of the wrong world's weight and puts it by, it is well with him suffering, though he'll face man's fate, how should he die? Seeing death has no part in him anymore, no power upon his head, he has got his eternity with his little hour and is not dead. For an hour, if you look for him, he is no more found. Physical death occurs for a while only, but that his survival is guaranteed after his death in the memories, in the ideas, in the ideals, and the values that he has established through his life. Then you live for an hour. If you look for him, he is no more found for 1 hour's space. Then you lift up your eyes to him and behold him crowned a deathless face. It was here that I stuck for days, for one word, for one proper word to convey this enormity of meaning. On the mountains of memory, by the world's well springs, in all men's eyes, where the light of the life of him is on all past things, death only dies. And my translation, I'll read out to you. वह कभी नहीं मरता है, वह तो जीता जगता रहता है, मरती है तो मौत। हर को उसका कर्म भोग और हर को उसका ताज, यह न्याय नियति देती है। अपना जीवन जो मानव औरों पर अर्पित करता है, मरकर भी वो जीता है। पीड़ित जग की व्यथा समेटे, जो ले लेता अपने मत्थे और रख देता बगल हटाकर, दुख उसका सहगामी बनता। मानव नियति सहता तो क्या, वह कैसे मर सकता है। देख मृत्यु का कोई उस पर वश न चलता, उसने क्रय कर लिया सनातन अपने छोटे जीवन से, हो गया अमर। ओझल रहता दृष्टि पटल से, मिलता हमको नहीं कहीं वह, होता यह बस कुछ लम्हों तक। Physical death takes him away just for a while. It was here that I was stuck for the right word, and I'll tell you what was that right word. फिर दृष्टि उठाओ, ऊपर देखो, धारे सिर पर शौर्य मुकुट वह मृत्युंजय. This was the word, and I have written this line for this word to convey that feeling of a literary translator. And I have told you, every translator knows the feeling of cobbling together words until, like some kind of unseen circuitry, this word came to my mind, and by like some unseen circuitry, the heavens light up. And then there was this word. फिर दृष्टि उठाओ, ऊपर देखो, धारे सिर पर शौर्य मुकुट वह मृत्युंजय. This was the word, mrityunjay, which suddenly solved my problem. यादों के पर्वत पर देखो, विश्व चेतना की धारा में, जन जन की आंखों में देखो, विद्यमान उसका प्रकाश जो अब तक बीत सब में जो अब तक बीत गया, मृत्यु ही मरती है केवल. You know, the second poem that I translated is Ekla Chalore. Ekla Chalore is a well-known poem by Rabindranath Tagore, and the second part of this book begins with this poem, with an English translation of this poem. When I was translating this book, I thought I should use already available Hindi translation of this poem and put it here, but I was not satisfied with that translation. I would read out that translation, which I didn't find quite, because there was so much padding in it. It was the Hindi translation that I found somewhere that I didn't like. तेरी आवाज पर कोई ना आए तो फिर चल अकेला रे, फिर चल अकेला चल अकेला चल अकेला रे, ओ तू चल अकेला चल अकेला चल अकेला चल अकेला रे, तेरी आवाज पर कोई ना आए तो फिर चल अकेला रे, फिर चल अकेला चल अकेला चल अकेला अकेला रे, यदि कोई भी ना बोले ओरे ओरे ओ अभागे, कोई भी ना बोले यदि सभी मुख मोड़ रहे सब डरा करे, तब डरे बिना तू मुक्त कंठ अपनी बात बोल अकेला रे, ओ तू मुक्त कंठ अपनी बात बोल अकेला रे, तेरी आवाज पे कोई ना आए तो फिर चल अकेला रे. This was the Hindi translation that I found somewhere. One word that I found in Bengali translation was hat bhar, and hat bhar, the unfortunate one, and the English translation of this poem in this book also is O thou of evil luck. I pondered it. A poet who is asking someone to go alone through all the odds stacked against his fate cannot call him an unfortunate man. And I did my translation like this. I used the phrase, "Tum apne ko abhaga mat samajhna." I translated it. अकेले चलो, अकेले चलते चलो, तुम्हारी पुकार पर कोई ना आए तो भी अकेले चलो, रुको मत, अकेले ही चलते चलो, वो डर जाए और दीवार के सामने मुंह खोकर दुबक जाए तो भी अपने को बदनसीब मत समझना. This was the change that I effected from the original. In the original it was Shatbha, unfortunate, but I changed it, do not consider yourself unfortunate. तो भी अपने को बदनसीब मत समझना, अपने दिमाग को खोल अपने आप से बोलना, वो वीराने में भी तुमसे अलग हो जाएं और तुम्हारा साथ छोड़ दें तो भी तुम अपने आप को बदनसीब मत समझना. कांटों को पैरों तले कुचलते जाना और लहू के रंगे रास्ते पर बढ़ते जाना अकेले ही, अगर वह अंधेरी रात में उठते तूफान में तुम्हें रोशनी न दिखाए, घबराना नहीं, अपने आप को बदनसीब मत समझना, अपने दर्द को पुलिस ज्वाला से अपने दिल में आग जलाना और उससे सुलगते रहना. I don't know, but certain aspects of literary translation that I have discussed, now the time is ticking by, and I thank all the organizers for giving me this opportunity. Literary translation, I wish all the participants, and with a humble request, that please follow this profession of literary translation. India, this multilingual country, multicultural country needs literary translation. We need to know what someone in a northeast village thinks about India. We need to know what someone in some remote village of Kashmir thinks about the other parts of India. So, literary translation is the need of the hour, And I take your leave. Thank you very much.